So let's talk about exposure response reprogramming, which is the most effective boundary work reprogramming process. So what is exposure response? Exposure response, especially as it relates to boundaries, is essentially the act of you incrementally exposing yourself, sort of like stretching your comfort zone incrementally to new experiences, new things that you're trying to do, new forms of communication. And then when you have that natural sort of knee-jerk reaction, which is your subconscious response, it's about consciously trying to change that by intentionally creating new ways of perceiving what's going on in the situation to create a different emotional output. So what you're basically doing as a result is you're getting your exposure, right, which is the action that you're repetitively doing, and then you're creating a new emotional response. So you're getting that same like repetition plus emotion, which is what's firing and wiring neural pathways and really solidifying these new patterns of behavior into the subconscious mind in order to create new results. Okay, so how do we use this practically with boundaries? First, we use the boundary identification process, and you decide where you'd like to be with boundaries and then write out your steps to getting there. Okay, so let's say, for example, you've decided that your boundary is, I want to tell my in-laws they're no longer allowed to show up unannounced at my home. And maybe they're constantly showing up unannounced, and maybe like you're in your PJs, or you're like, not feeling put together, the house isn't clean, and you're feeling like this is a boundary violation, it's not okay. So maybe you are going, I don't know if I can just tell them that right away. That's a big stretch for me in terms of my comfort zone if I'm not used to setting boundaries whatsoever. So you start small. Your first step here is going to be to break everything down into very tiny chunks, okay? So it's technically your second step. Your first step is to identify what the boundary is through the boundary identification process. Second step is to break everything down into little steps. So for example, you might go, okay, well, I want to be at a place where I can just say that directly, but my steps to getting there, what would feel safe for me to incrementally stretch my comfort zone is maybe to start by saying, when they come and they show up unannounced, oh, I wish I had more time to prepare for you coming over. And maybe you sort of like get close to expressing the boundary. And then maybe the next time you say, hey, I always appreciate knowing ahead of time when guests come for a visit, but I'm still so happy to see you. And then maybe the third time, you can really set that boundary by, using that process of expression. You validate their sponsoring intentions behind their actions. So, maybe you recognize that they just want to come over and connect. So you say something like, hey, I love that you want to come over and connect and hang out. I appreciate the thoughtfulness to take the time, but I really need you to call ahead. I'm very busy at this point in my life, and it can disrupt the plans if you don't let me know ahead of time that you're going to be coming. I'm always so happy to see you with notice, though, and I really appreciate you respecting that boundary. So see what you did? You validated their sponsoring intention behind the action, right? You set your boundary, you explained your why, and then you closed, okay? And so that might be your endpoint, but you have these incremental responses of getting there. So step one, you identify where you want to be. Step two, you break it into smaller chunks, and you use that boundary identification process and communication process. And then step three, you have to intentionally lace a conscious perception to create a new emotional output every time that you access the steps, okay? So maybe the first time you say, oh, I really wish I had more time to prepare for you coming over. And maybe your natural feeling is to panic and be like, they're gonna reject me. You have to consciously perceive it differently. You have to choose to perceive it differently. Like saying things to yourself, such as, hey, this is healthy for the longevity of this relationship. This is important for my in-laws to understand me and for me to show up authentically, and this was courageous of me to do. And so you're going to choose with your conscious mind to perceive things differently, not through that fear-based response that was conditioned all the way back in childhood that's now outdated. You're choosing to perceive differently so that you can create new emotional output, so that you're repetitively and incrementally trying new things, gaining a new perception and a new emotional association, and that repetition plus emotion together are reprogramming. So you expose to a new behavior, you intentionally lace a new perception and new emotion to the behavior by thinking differently about it and creating new thoughts. And this is going to create active reprogramming. And because boundaries are such an action-oriented thing, you get to encompass changing your perception about the core wound, You get to encompass a new action or behavior, a new emotional response. You use the boundary identification process. You're tying everything together through this type of exposure response activity for boundaries specifically, okay? So I'll give you a couple other little examples. Let's say that you would feel, in terms of your core wounds, like I am bad for setting a boundary with my in-laws. A new way of perceiving that might be I'm innocent. This is healthy to do. This is innocent. This doesn't make me a bad person. And this is actually really good for me and for this relationship long term. And it's good for them to understand, the boundaries for other people. It's healthy for them to have to learn that as well. Maybe if you're telling yourself the story, I'm a burden if I express a need to my in-laws. Maybe you flip it and you perceive it differently from the perspective of, hey, I wouldn't feel this way if somebody set a boundary like this with me. I would understand, and this is worthy of being understood, okay? So the idea here is for you to really try to perceive the situation differently. So you're bringing in some of that core wound reprogramming, you're identifying your boundaries, you're communicating them incrementally, you're taking the action, doing the work, and this is going to create the best long-term results in terms of setting the boundaries themselves. So I hope that you practice this and work on this, because this is so important, and boundaries are extremely important for the health and well-being of all of our relationships, especially the relationship to yourself. And I want to leave you with one thought here, which is so much of the art of building self-trust in the relationships to ourselves, feeling confident to make decisions, to take action in our lives, to do things in a different direction, to go against the grain if we need to achieve or create the things that we want to in our lifetime, has to do with how much we trust ourselves in the first place. And the biggest component that leads to self-trust or a lack thereof is how much we are able to take ourselves truly into consideration when we are feeling certain feelings, when we have to make certain choices or decisions. And this has so much to do with the art of setting boundaries with ourselves and with others in our lives. So this will be extremely important, not just for the health of your relationships, but for your long-term success, for your fulfillment, your well-being as a human being. And I hope you take the time to really work through this course, go through these exercises and activities, and give yourself this gift. So thank you so much for watching and for being in this course. I can't wait to see you in the next courses and in the live webinars. So our last exercise is our boundary reprogramming exercise. So the purpose of this is to basically, you're breaking things down here into exposure response work so that you can incrementally expose yourself to new experiences, as we keep talking about, new forms of communication, and intentionally create new ways of perceiving the situation so that you have new emotional output, okay? So you're just picking a boundary that you have and you're breaking it down into incremental chunks. This is just taking the work that we've done so far and talked about so far in this webinar and expanding it outwards so that you have like the clearest possible steps and strategies to support yourself in your boundary setting process. Okay, so let's just pick practicing speaking up when you feel unseen or unheard. I think everybody can sort of relate to that in some form, okay? So let's say Bob, your coworker, now let's say Bob, your brother, okay? Bob, your brother, always speaks over you and seems to not validate your opinion, and so your boundary is going to be to start like speaking up to him. But maybe you're scared. Maybe your whole life he's been your older brother and he's been really tough on you in terms of conflict and always seeming bigger and stronger and scary, and you're afraid to have conflict with Bob, your brother. So chunk number one, okay, so you're breaking the boundary down. So you've identified it in the earlier process. Remember, these exercises are sort of building on each other. So you've identified what your boundary is in the earlier process and part of the workbook. And maybe your boundary is, I will speak up every single time that, this is the end goal, to speak up every single time that Bob violates a boundary, and tell him that I feel misunderstood and unheard, and then explain myself. And so now you're breaking this into little tiny chunks. So maybe chunk one in terms of exposure response is going to be, I will tell Bob that I will be working on setting more boundaries, and that it is important for me in our relationship to feel seen heard, understood. Okay, chunk 2. I will express to Bob that I feel misunderstood and ask him to hold space to better explain my opinion. Okay? And again, you can get really specific. You can be like, it could be your opinion, it could be your feeling, it could be a spiritual thing, like it can be any area of life, but you'll have identified this ahead of time. The more specific, the better. Okay? Chunk 3, I will commit to speaking up each and every time Bob doesn't understand me and ensure that I get heard. So really take the time to be like, you know what? And if Bob interrupts, hey Bob, just a moment, you're doing it again. Please let me get my point across. I really want to finish what I was saying. And then I'm happy to hear you out and everything you have to say. Okay? So now let's say each of these, okay, so I hope that makes sense so far. Then we're going to look for, in each of these chunks, the scary story that you're carrying, which is probably the reason you haven't done this already, right? Then from here, you're going to create a perceptual reframe. So let's say chunk number 1. So we'll refer back to our first chunk, okay? I will tell Bob that I will be working on setting more boundaries and that it's important for me to feel seen and heard in our relationship, okay? So maybe your fear is that Bob won't care, okay? And so he won't want to listen. And so you want to really question this story, okay? Can I 100% know that Bob's not going to care? And do I have equilibrating pieces of evidence? And from that, like, what's my best one? You know, I know Bob cares because he's my brother and he's done so many things to look out for me my whole life and X, Y, and Z, okay? So you're reframing that. You could even look at it and be like, I need Bob to care in order to honor myself. Is it true? No, because this is about me. So this is about me actually showing up in the relationship to myself for the first time and actually having these tough conversations and doing the work and honoring myself the way I've been honoring Bob and putting him on a pedestal and never saying anything this whole time because I'm so afraid of tarnishing the relationship. So whatever it is, like, you're making a perceptual reframe. I'm just giving you some examples. You're making the ones that stick for you, okay? So maybe you look and you're like, no, Bob is a very caring brother. And if I communicate effectively, I am certain he will want to work on this with me, or he'll want to hear me out, whatever it is. So you're picking a perceptual reframe so that when you fear the thing that you're about to do, you already know that you've like questioned the story, you've looked at it differently, and you've got some evidence to help you feel safe and supported in terms of your emotional perceptions you're bringing into the situation, so you're more likely to take positive action, okay? Chunk number 2, perceptual reframe. I will express to Bob that I feel misunderstood and ask him to hold space better to explain my opinion. And maybe you're like, maybe your original fear is, well, Bob doesn't even know what holding space means. Bob never listens to other people, and that's your painful story. Okay, great. What's a perceptual reframe? Worst case scenario, I'll explain to Bob very specifically what I need. Right? That's my new way of looking at the situation. That's my new way of reframing it so that I ensure that I reach my boundary. Okay? So worst case scenario, I will just have to break it down for Bob and explain. Okay? And I hope you guys are going through and doing this at the same time. And then chunk number 3, I will commit to speaking up each time Bob doesn't understand me. And maybe your scary story in there is like, I'm afraid to make that commitment because if I forget, I'll give myself a hard time. Great. What's your new way of looking at the situation and reframing it? I will commit to honoring myself during this process and not beating myself up. I trust that I will do my best. Whatever it is, I'm just coming up with these things like off the cuff. So have a new way of looking at the situation that literally takes the time to make you feel super supported in the dynamic, okay? And you can reprint this sheet, you can erase it and redo it for every single thing that you really want to focus on in terms of boundaries in your life. And this is going to help you to like deeply go through and set it up. And then if you want, you can use the line space at the end here to break down your boundary setting goals in more chunks. Like if you need more chunks than just 1, 2, and 3, if you need like 7 exposure response steps because it's really scary to you and these are really big things, perfect. take the time to honor that for yourself and actually expand it out, use more steps, do more work, put more stuff into it, and that's going to be extremely effective and empowering. And then obviously at the back pages, you've got your resources and materials to help support you on your journey, and that is your boundary setting workbook.